Thank you so much for coming. When I saw people already here like 45 minutes ago, I was sort of gobsmacked. So thank you for your enthusiasm for climate solutions. Okay, all right. Perfect reply. I'm going to just introduce the two incredible people who are here to chat with me in front of you tonight. First is Maggie Thomas, who is a climate policy expert. She's currently serving as Special Assistant to President Biden for Climate in the Office of Domestic Climate Policy. And before landing in the White House, she co-founded the climate advocacy group Evergreen Action and worked on the climate teams of presidential candidates Senator Elizabeth Warren and Governor Jay Inslee. She is an alumna of the Yale School of Environment and, fun fact, once upon a time helped research urban red-tailed hawks. So she is a woman of many interests and talents. And we have Dr. Miriam Goldstein, Director of Ocean Policy at the White House in the Council of Environmental Quality. And before joining CEQ, she served as Senior Director of Conservation Policy at the nonpartisan think tank Center for American Progress, where she directed the Ocean Policy team. She also worked for Congress, both as Legislative Director for Representative Jackie Speer and as a Legislative Fellow for the House Natural Resources Committee and for Senator Ed Markey. Miriam has a PhD in biological oceanography. Shout out to the ocean. From Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she studied the ecological impacts of plastic pollution in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So again, a woman of many talents and interests, and is an excellent scuba diver. I know this because she was my dive buddy briefly for my own PhD research in Curacao, because we went to graduate school together. And this is actually like a great example, the two of you, of how I put this book together, which is by calling all my smart, interesting, lovely friends and saying, what if we get it right? Because I came up with the title and then was basically like, oh shit, how do I answer this question? It's way too big for any one person to answer. And there's so many different topics and subtopics. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to crack open the book yet, I will spoil nothing really by telling you that there are 20 interviews in the book with all sorts of different experts, along with essays that I wrote and poetry and original commissioned artworks. So there's lots for everyone and many, many what if questions. And there's a chapter in there called A Blue New Deal, which features both Miriam and Maggie, because it's something that we had the chance to collaborate on together over the last 4 or 5 years now, which is a lesson in and of itself. So we're going to dive into that chapter with you all tonight. Each of the stops on my book tour has been a totally different event with different people. Some of them involved hula hoops and poetry and dance-offs and magic tricks and comedians. This one, I'm sorry to say, for DC, we're going full wonk on you. I think you guys can handle it. So maybe just so I don't completely bias the audience, we could start by just sharing the stories of how we met, because I know at least, Maggie, you have a slightly different take on remembering this than I do.
Yeah. Is this on? Hello? Great. Well, thanks so much for being here, everyone. We are really excited to talk about climate solutions on a Saturday night. So thank you all.
True, like packing the house on a Saturday night for a climate book. Pretty impressive.
So Ayana and I met for the first time when I was working on the Warren campaign as then Senator Warren and presidential candidates' climate advisor on the campaign side. And should I go for the whole, like, how did the Blue New Deal happen, or are you going to go back to that?
How we met.
Okay, just how we met. We'll come back to that other spicy story in a second. Spicy for politics. And yeah, I was tasked with writing the Blue New Deal plan which was a bit overwhelming, although I do have my own background in marine science, although it never came to fruition as an actual career for me. I was really excited. My mom was thrilled that all of those years of like marine science camp were finally coming to fruition. I was going to write the Blue New Deal. And then I sat down to my computer and I was like, wow, I'm just really not sure what to do. And I had been following Ayana on Instagram. And as I remember it, I sent you an Instagram DM.
Okay, we can check the record on this later.
And was like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Would you be willing to help me with the Blue New Deal? And, you know, there had been other policy documents that had happened, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But, and then Ayana and I set up a phone call.
That's the part I remember. I just feel like she got my phone number because, like, I don't know, you worked for the Warren campaign. I'm sure they had my number. I was giving them literally all of my money.
You guys, it might have been me. It actually might have been me.
Okay. Well, here we go. As I remember that moment, I remember getting this phone call from an unknown number and being really brave to answer it because it was like 2020 and I was living with my mom at our family farm and had nothing else to do. And I was looking out the window and I was looking at the vegetable garden and it was just like this glorious, lush scenario. And I get this call from Maggie Thomas asking me if I'm going to help write one of Elizabeth Warren's famous plans, right? Like, I have a plan for that, Warren. And I was like, this is the dorkiest, favoritist question I've ever been asked in my entire life. Is this real? And so it began.
And thank God you said yes.
I mean, how could you say no to that? I mean, we'll get to the lessons from this later, but I feel like, yes, I, was a supporter of the Warren campaign and ended up with you getting more and more involved and actually becoming a surrogate, which is bonkers to me in hindsight.
And I staffed you.
And you staffed me in New Hampshire during the primaries where I had to like pretend to be Elizabeth Warren in a candidate forum, which was
where
terrifying.
You brought your own printer.
I did. I had a tiny, tiny printer in my carry-on suitcase to print out my speech because I knew I would be writing at the very last minute. And I printed it out in a coffee shop in New Hampshire, which everyone was like, why is this woman taking a printer out of her purse? Anyway, by any means necessary. So here we are 5 or more years later. And then Miriam, I don't actually remember the moment we met. You were 1 year behind me in graduate school.
Yeah, I don't remember either, but I do think the bonding happened in Curacao. We're doing all that scuba diving and swimming offshore to the sites. We were just doing shore diving. So there was 30 minutes of swimming to get to these sites. So we learned a lot about each other.
Is there a dive safety plan for this? Like, this seems kind of sketchy. It's very remote. And I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
No.
But I also learned that Ayana doesn't breathe. You are
I'm
under
very
there for
good
a
at
very long time. So I became a much better diver.
This is one of my weird skills that I don't use anymore, is that I can make it a lot of minutes on a single tank of scuba air. But I also remember at the time I was just like, why does everyone in science grad school wear science pants?
That's true.
I was like, everyone's got these weird cargo pants.
I love science pants. I actually, for you, I wore my science shoes. I did it for you.
Thank you so much. And when Miriam moved to DC all those years later, she was like, so I'm giving up my science pants. Can you please help me figure out how to dress for DC? And look at you now with a blazer and the whole thing.
I was like, do I have to wear nylons? I did ask you that.
Nylons. I was like, no.
She's like, no, you really, you don't.
So let's talk about the Blue New Deal in particular, and then we'll zoom out to other climate, ocean policy things. But for me, when I was writing the chapter on it, it was the hardest chapter in the book to write because there's so many details, and I was trying not to make it boring. But it was, for me, I had never been part of something that had so many steps. I thought that it was going to be a chapter that was like the 10 steps to ocean policy. There are more than 10 steps. And I was just sort of like, oh, we're writing another op-ed. Oh, there's another policy memo. Oh, and now we're doing polling. Oh, and now we're like in the campaign, and now we're out of the campaign, and now it's the White House, and now it's Congress. And I found it to be really enlightening as to the policymaking process, even as someone who like thought she knew how the sausage gets made. So I'm curious to hear from you two kind of what were the lessons learned or key moments for you along the way.
Oh no, I have to go first. Okay. Yeah, I think my biggest lesson in my whole career has been, it is in the book, about finding your people and having that group of people that you can take those steps forward with, because it doesn't come fast and it doesn't come easy. So you just have to keep taking those little steps forward. And if you're surrounded by people who can be your companions, co-conspirators, thought partners, people you can reach out to when it gets really hard, that I think is the key to allowing you to continue to make progress on what it is you're trying to do. And in this case, it was that ocean policy, Blue New Deal work.
Find your people. Yeah.
Find your people.
You guys are my people.
Oh.
Yes, Maggie, thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting sort of looking back at the arc of the Blue New Deal, because I don't think that I ever would have outlined the steps in the way that they happened. Mm-hmm. When you work in politics, you spend a lot of time thinking about like campaign design and the strategy, and this happens, and then you have to do that, and all the pieces line up, and like, that's just not at all how it actually works. The best laid plans are indeed just best laid plans. And, I think one of the really, at least for me, important steps in the process was when Bren Smith, who is also featured in the book, an incredible regenerative ocean farmer, he actually had his question picked for Elizabeth Warren's CNN climate town hall, which was this like incredible 7-hour marathon of all of the candidates doing 40-minute climate town halls. And
because the DNC wouldn't let them do a climate specific debate, right. And they were like going to get in trouble if they did one that was unofficial. So this was CNN's response was, we'll just do them back to back
7 hours.
7 hours. So I was like, let's make popcorn and like watch this thing. Most people were like, what is even happening? Yeah.
I was driving from Seattle, where I had been working on the Jay Inslee campaign, and he had just dropped out of the race just before these CNN town halls had launched, which was sort of ironic that he had dropped out and then CNN, did the CNN climate town halls. So I had the entire way to drive from Seattle to San Francisco to listen to it. And it was great entertainment. But, I think if someone had asked me, even when I was working for Governor Inslee at the time, like, hey, if Bren Smith asks a question about a Blue New Deal or regenerative ocean farming, do you think CNN is going to say yes? I don't think I would have said yes.
Yeah.
And so I think, one of the really key lessons for me, whether it be about specifically the Blue New Deal or sort of about climate policy and politics at large, is just you kind of don't know when your moment is going to come. Mm-hmm. And so even the big and crazy ideas, if they seem that way at the time, aren't going to end up being so big and crazy, 5 years later. And so, like, thank goodness you and Bren and others had the courage to come together and say, yeah, let's submit a video to CNN and ask this question about the Blue New Deal. Because there's so many steps then cascaded from that moment that if you had asked like a political consultant at the time, should I do this? I don't think you would have gotten a lot of yeses.
But also, like, why wouldn't you? Right? If CNN's like, anyone can submit a video question. And so we found out, and Bren is the co-founder of Greenwave. He's a kelp and oyster farmer. And Greenwave is training thousands of people to become regenerative ocean farmers to support the development of that market, that whole sector. I've collaborated with him on the policy pieces of that. Known him for many years. I'm actually on the board of Greenwave. And so I hate doing selfie videos knows. So I was like, Bren, you got to do this one. And he was like, oh, okay, fine. And so he took this video and he's just like always wearing a flannel shirt and looking very rugged. So it kind of worked. And I think I actually have the question. Let's see. Yes, this was step 5 in my retelling of it. And it just happened to be addressed to Warren. So all these questions were just like asked to random candidates. And he said in this video, my oyster farm was destroyed by 2 hurricanes. Didn't think this was going to be quite so timely, but here we are. Now, warming waters and acidification are killing seed, oyster and kelp seed, coast to coast, and reducing yields. Those of us that work on the water, we need climate solutions, and we need them now. The trouble is the Green New Deal only mentions our ocean one time. This is despite the fact that our seas soak up more than 25% of the world's carbon. So, what's your plan for a Blue New Deal for those of us working on the ocean? And Warren goes, I like that. Just her gut reaction. And, this is Bren's video continued. How do we make sure how do we make sure that all of us can make a living on a living planet? And Warren said, I think he's got it exactly right. We need a Blue New Deal as well. And then apparently Warren turned to Maggie and was like, we need a Blue New Deal plan.
Well, first I had to get hired.
Yeah, so Maggie got the job.
I was driving without a job.
This is true. And then she called me, and then we wrote a Blue New Deal plan. But this all started because, I read the Green New Deal. How many people in here have read the Green New Deal? Oh, most of any audience ever. People who did not raise their hands. How many pages do you think it is? Just shout it out.
105.
Louder numbers. Okay. We got a really wide range here. The answer is 14. It's also double-spaced and massive font. And the first page, I think, is just all the co-sponsors' names. So it'll take you 5 minutes to read it. I was very relieved when I opened the PDF and I was like, oh, okay. This is a much smaller project than I had anticipated. But of course, I got to page 13 out of 14 before I saw any mention of the ocean. And we know that ocean climate solutions are 30-40% of what's going to get us there. So if we're leaving the ocean out of federal climate policy, we're leaving out a lot of possibilities. And so I was just sort of cranky about this, having lunch in New York with the CEO of Surfrider, Chad Nelson. And we were like, maybe we should be cranky more formally in the form of an op-ed. And then we found out Bren was writing one, and we teamed up with Bren, and then we co-authored this op-ed, The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal. And that kind of kicked off this whole thing of just essentially complaining in public, advocating for the inclusion of the ocean. And I think the thing that surprised me was by the end we had written, it's been 5 years, 5 op-eds, 4 policy memos, 2 polls, 2 executive orders, a funding guidebook, an ocean justice platform, a White House action plan, a White House ocean justice strategy, a city-level policy framework, and innumerable meetings, calls, emails, and texts into the work of bringing the elements of a Blue New Deal to life. And of course, for decades before that, all these people were just laying the groundwork and doing other related pieces of this. It just makes me think that this is an endurance scenario. So I'm curious how you think of the pace of climate work. How do you perceive that now that you're on the inside in the White House executive offices?
Sure. It's funny that you call it an endurance exercise because in my office, we have this joke that every 3 months is another sprint. But at the end of the sprint, you actually just do another 3-month sprint. And we have continued to do 3-month sprint after 3-month sprint for nearly 4 years now. So indeed, more endurance than I probably would have expected at the beginning in that first 1, 2, or 3 sprints. To be honest with you. But, I think it's incredibly important to look at the progress that you've made, but also be very mindful of where you have to go and find inspiration in the long game. when you're working on an issue as urgent and as big as climate change, something that affects all of humanity. So there's a lot of pressure on you when you're in the White House working on it. There are the most people ever working on climate change in a White House in the Biden-Harris administration. And there are still far too few people working on climate in a White House, let alone across the entire administration. So, I guess I would say it's sort of a combination of those sprints and piecing together those sprints and having the endurance to continue to do it, to recognize your role. One of the things I think you talk about in the book and that you talk about very eloquently is that everyone has a role to play. And it doesn't mean that you have to be a climate scientist. It doesn't mean that you have to be a greenhouse gas accountant. What it means is that you have to find the thing that moves you and the thing that brings you joy and figure out how to infuse climate in it. And so I think that's very much part of what keeps me going and has kept me there for almost 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'll even take like a slightly longer timeline, which is so much of policy is just working and working for something that you think is important. And then there's a moment. And unfortunately for Maggie, and to a lesser extent myself, the moment is this whole administration. So it's like a 4-year moment. But all of the work that is allowing the sprint now and the progress that we're seeing now, all that has been laid in over many years, decades even. And so you have to do that work, even when it's not the moment, in order to be ready for your moment. And I want to give credit to my old boss, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who, this is a totally different issue, but really, really cared about, still does care. She's just not in Congress anymore. She really cares about gender equality in the workplace. And she just worked on that for decades. And then there was the Me Too moment, and she was able to make several really important changes both in Congress and the federal government, and get that legislation passed because she was ready for that moment. And I think that's in general how it works all across the board in policy. So if you're not, like, the work is not wasted. It might seem that a certain white paper, op-ed, convening, it just happens in the void, but it doesn't, as long as you have your people and keep taking those steps forward, because the moment will come.
So I tried to summarize what I thought the lessons were from this whole crazy last 5 years of being a part of this from the outside. And I'm curious what you might add to my list of 4 things here. So number 1 was write it down, because talk is cheap. And once you have the op-ed or the policy memo or whatever, then it's like a real thing you can actually pass along. The pen is mighty. Number 2 was, as you said, like, find your people and team up with other organizations, with people in different parts of the country, these, collaborations, coalitions, and also like make friends with people in the administration is actually a significant part of this.
Very friendly.
Yes. And the 3rd was tell a compelling story, right? Like, we worked so hard on the narrative pieces of this, understanding different stakeholders' perspectives, how to bring those to the table, bringing in the economics and the job pieces of it, as well as the conservation and coastal communities pieces. And the one that like maybe sticks with me the most is don't quit on big ideas. Because of that moment of opportunity that you don't know when it's going to arise, but also because politicians come and go. But if the thing is important, you just keep doing it regardless of who's in office. And I'm curious if there's like a 5th or 6th you would add to this list, not just from collaborating around ocean climate policy, but in thinking about like the last few years of your work in the White House. Enlighten us. You're near the end of this presidential term. Drop some knowledge.
Great. Okay. I think I would have 2 amendments to the list.
Okay.
One I just thought of. We haven't talked about this one. The first is that details matter.
Yes.
It is great and incredible to have big ideas, and there always needs to be somebody who has the vision and paints the picture of the place that you're trying to go. But the way that policy works is that you need to know like what law to change or what regulation, what are the words in the regulation that you have to amend. And so the details really, really matter. And when you're on the inside of government, like we are, that is what we are pushed to do every day, is try to figure out how do we take that vision and downscale it to those details so that we can make the steps of change add up to that really big, bold idea. And then the next thing I would say is that the politics really matter. And, you know, that's sort of about the people, and it's about telling a compelling story. But at the end of the day, at every step of the policymaking process, you need to make sure that the politics line up so that you can continue to keep doing the good work that you're doing. And, you know, I would argue that in the Biden-Harris administration, we wouldn't have been able to generate over $1 trillion of private sector money flowing into the clean energy economy, more than 330,000 clean energy jobs created, if we hadn't set up the politics every step of the way, pre-IRA, post-IRA, implementation, and every step along the way. So I think, yeah, details matter and the politics matter.
Totally agree. I would add, and it kind of just overlaps with all of these other points, is working in collaboration with people whom you, and entities who you may not agree, may have a different orientation, and may just frankly be very difficult to work with. That is so much of the key. I mean, at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, our job is to coordinate the federal government in all the different agencies and departments to continue to advance the president's environmental priorities. So I'm not probably supposed to say it this way, but I'm going to. I'm a professional cat herder. That's what I do. And making progress when you have both organizations and personalities coming from many, many different perspectives and trying to figure out how to move forward together. What are the shared things you can do together? Maybe it's not everything, but it's usually something, and taking those small steps forward. Really big believer in small steps, because having that big goal in mind, but taking the steps you can at that moment that the politics allow, and just keep on going.
So I'm curious. I have so many questions. I'm curious what.
Wait, am I allowed to interject?
Oh, please.
Just to the last point you made about sort of thinking about who you work with and finding points of alignment, I think is really, really important, and something that I have spent a lot of time learning in this job. Is there are a lot of people, it turns out, when you work in the White House, who like to tell you how to do your job. And, you know, sometimes they're more vocal, sometimes they're less vocal, sometimes they do it in the newspaper, sometimes they do it by yelling at you outside the gates. Sometimes there's like a lot of ways that they can tell us how to do our job. And you know, we don't have 100% alignment in the Climate Policy Office with every person that comes forward and says they've got an idea. But it is our job to take the meeting and find those places of alignment. And so, you know, I probably wouldn't have spent a lot of time with certain sectors of the private sector. I wouldn't have been inclined to do that before taking this job. But I think when it comes to lining up the politics, you have to force yourself to find those places of alignment. And it can be a little uncomfortable at times. And, you know, particularly when the record of who you take meetings with is public, that also becomes a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so I just want to double down on that point, is that I think sometimes it might not be who you expect it to be that you're taking that meeting with, or you're spending that 30 minutes or 45 or an hour with. But something will come from it, and you have to give yourself the space. And the policy and the politics need to allow for that space to be able to have these big ideas move forward, so that you can get one more person on your side and have, you know, achieve that big, bold vision.
Well, let's talk about one specific example of like a coalition of organizations. This is something, Miriam, that you and I worked really closely on, which is this concept of ocean justice, right? So you came up with this idea, I remember, because when we think about environmental justice, we think about climate justice, rarely are people talking about ocean issues at all. But of course, there's lots of ways that justice and ocean economy, communities, conservation intersect. And so Miriam was like, okay, well, what if we did what the climate justice community is doing, bring together a coalition of all different sorts of orgs to have some sort of consensus policy platform or statement. And so you called me and Jean Flemma, my co-founder for Urban Ocean Lab, our think tank for the future of coastal cities. And we're like, what do you think? And of course, we naively, in my case, not naively in Jean's case, she was like, oh, this is going to be hard, but we should do it anyway. And we pulled together this coalition. So I'd love to hear, my version of the story is in the book. So I'd love to hear more from you about kind of how that came together and some of the ripples that it's made so far. It's kind of there's a lot of details. So maybe just give us the highlights and I can point to me if you want me to fill anything in.
Okay. Highlights. I will say that the beginning was even more chaotic than you described because I had gone around, I was at Center for American Progress at the time and had, thought this was a good idea. And I mentioned it to a funder and they're like, great. Here's some money. You should do this. And I was like, oh no. Oh, wait, that's when I called you and Jean. I said, I've accidentally raised some money and I think we should do this. But yeah, and I want to give full credit to the Equitable and Just National Climate Forum on which this is modeled. That was, I was through my position at that time, got to intersect with them a little bit and could see the power of the work they were doing in the environmental justice space. And the ocean world is adjacent, but wasn't overlapping as much and needed to really be thought through. Because you could see that the benefits of the ocean were not shared equitably among communities in all these different facets. So after the panicked call to Jean Ayana, who thought this was a good idea, we built the steering committee of the other members of whom are Colette Pichon-Battle, who is in the book, and Mars Gutierrez-Gradinch, who is the CEO of Azul, which is a environmental justice organization in California. And off we went. So I will now summarize. After a year, 18
maybe
months.
Just briefly, the coalition that came together was, yes, Black folks in the Gulf, Taproot Earth, like fishermen in New England, Latina surfers in California, indigenous kelp farmers in Alaska, Native Hawaiians, and also like national groups like Greenpeace, NRDC, Earth Justice, Oceana, 18 organizations working on this from very different angles, but caring about this idea of ocean justice, spent a year and a half or so.
Yeah, a year and a half or so.
Meeting. Janisha Shrestha, who's in the front row, is now my chief of staff and then was the project manager trying to hold that whole crazy coalition together.
Sorry, Janisha.
And also thank you. And then we actually came up with something.
I mean, talk about sort of sitting with discomfort in community. There was a lot of that. It was hard, but I mean, I don't mean to relate everything to the list in the book, but it's a really good list. Like we wrote it down, right? Like that was the whole point, the point was always we were going to write the ocean justice platform. Like that was always the goal, is to get this document written. And we did. And it came out in September 2022, I think. And what was really funny about it was I as part of the rollout, I briefed the White House from my then seat outside the White House. And then later in the beginning of 2023, I was able to come in and then carry out some of the recommendations that were part of that platform. Not all, because that is not how we do things, but the ideas were there and written down.
Yeah. That was what was so remarkable to me was how much appetite there was to listen to this this policy platform from inside the executive branch, right? So when we briefed CEQ and OSTP, I think 90 something executives from across the different federal agencies that had ocean jurisdiction showed up for our webinar to hear what we had to say. We had briefings with, the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and their whole leadership team. It was at a moment when people were more committed to pursuing justice than they perhaps are now, but didn't really know what would that mean in an ocean context. So you have a lot of well-meaning federal bureaucrats who are sure, we're happy to hear your thoughts on this. And the lesson for me that I didn't put in the book perhaps is just the power of the coalition. Because if Urban Ocean Lab or Center for American Progress alone had put this out, we might have gotten a little traction, but it was having such a diverse coalition that I think unlocked the attention that led to you being able to implement some of these recommendations once you were inside, and specifically
ocean justice strategy.
Oh, I didn't know we were getting groovy with it.
Yeah. So, part of the Blue New Deal work ended up inspiring the Ocean Climate Action Plan, which I don't know if you want to do a little side track there, because that is what called for in the Ocean Climate Action Plan. That's what called for the federal government to write an ocean justice strategy, because it was clear, climate and justice are linked. You can't have one without the other. So, the Blue New Deal work led directly through this path to this eventual federal ocean justice strategy, which I will say is one of the things that I'm really just incredibly proud of having been a part of in this job.
And it was launched at the UN COP climate conference last December?
December, 23. Yep, that's right. Yeah, so the Ocean Climate Action Plan came out March 23, and then Ocean Justice Strategy in December 23, which, if you've ever worked on federal committees, was a lot of work. That was
very fast.
That was very fast.
Yeah.
And I think it showed, though, the commitment of those sort of federal folks who really wanted to be a part of this, because we had this amazing working group through the Ocean Policy Committee, who's our interagency committee that works on ocean policy. But these regular government folks were so personally committed. They put a lot of time into this document and are still now back in their agencies working on advancing the principles laid out there. My favorite, just off the top of my head, is pay your interns, which is in the Ocean Justice Strategy. But there's a lot more in there.
So I find this so exciting because, to think that an external group, as you were describing, Maggie, you guys have to take some meetings with us and you have to listen, but you don't have to necessarily.
To be clear, we want to take the meetings.
Okay, right. You want to hear what constituents and stakeholders have to say, and then consider what you might do after having listened. And I was actually, even though you had gone from helping write that to that ocean justice platform to going into the White House to work on ocean policy, I was still surprised when the ocean justice strategy, laying out how the federal government and different agencies should implement this concept of ocean justice. This is now federal guidance that people can and should follow. It's a question of how deeply that will be implemented into the future, right? But the guidelines are there. I was kind of surprised to see that, and obviously very gratified when I found out how 90-something% of the comments that were submitted about that mentioned the Ocean Justice Forum and platform, to see that as a direct line. And I'm curious, Maggie, just from your perspective, you didn't work on this particular element of it. Anything that you saw from the outside were oh, well, that just happened? Anything come to mind for you? Sorry, this is not a great question.
A surprise one, too.
Yeah. Or what do you...
on my team is back there. Just
what is she going to say? Maybe a better question is, let me rethink this. So there's obviously a lot more work left to do on ocean and climate policy. We've checked off some important boxes in the last few years. What's next? What do you wish for the next big thing? Is
Great
it
question.
already in the works? Can we get it done, by January? Like,
There's lots of big things that are left, to be sure. We can't tell them all to you now, but wait and see. No, I think, one of the things, just going back to the ocean plans that Miriam was mentioning, they were very intersectional in their approach, right? It wasn't just about working waterfronts. It wasn't just about regenerative ocean farming. It wasn't just about, adaptation and resilience and the role that the oceans play or that coastal communities play. It was also
offshore wind was in there too.
Exactly. It was also about offshore wind. So my office in particular has spent a lot of time working on the offshore wind element of it. When the president first came in, he set a goal by 2030 to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed. Just recently, we hit half of that goal, which is pretty exciting. So the administration has approved 10 offshore wind projects. We have literally stood up an entire industry. When you look at the supply chain for offshore wind, this is one of my favorite statistics. There are 50 states that are involved in the offshore wind supply chain.
All 50 states.
All 50 states. Pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yep. And so
DC claps for supply chains.
really thrown off by that. So all to say, I think that intersectional approach is absolutely the way that we're going to have to continue to think about different aspects of the climate challenge. And so no matter what sector of the economy you're talking about, it's our office's job to coordinate the all of government approach in the federal government's response to tackling the climate crisis. That means to make every agency a climate agency, not just the ones that you think of, but it means working with, housing and urban development. It means working with the education department. You name it, we work with them. And I think we really are absolutely going to have to continue to sort of take that intersectional approach. So when you think about kind of where the tons are left, which is in our parlance,
like tons of greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
To be clear.
Yeah. MMTs, if you will.
Okay. Wouldn't be DC without an acronym drop.
I thought maybe that would get a clap. So when you think about where the tons are left and the sectors of the economy that are sort of going to drive the most of those tons, there are places like the industrial sector, for example. This is classically a dirty job, so to speak. It was traditionally considered a hard to decarbonize sector and is now not at all. We know exactly what we need to do. We know that we've made the investments, and we know we need to do more, and we need to
Which
continue.
sector is this?
The industrial sector. This is like the one that makes all
manufacturing.
the stuff. Manufacturing, yeah. And all the inputs to make the stuff, most importantly. So it's a bunch of things that we've probably all never heard of. But it often takes a lot of very high heat to make steel, for example. So how do you get heat that high? How do you get the temperature that high? Traditionally, you've burned the dirtiest kind of coal.
Right.
But we know now, because of investments that we've made, that it's actually possible to invest in clean steel. And we've done that at a plant called Cleveland Cliffs in Ohio. And for the first time in America, we are now making clean steel. And so there's lots of different places, just to sort of bring back to the original question. I think this intersectional approach is we've, for better or for worse, we've got a lot of the low-hanging fruit done. We did the easy stuff. And now I think we need to think really expansively about the way that we continue to tackle the challenge. And we go to all of the different parts of the economy and the different sectors of the economy to get the job done.
Miriam, anything on your wish list to wrap up in the next few months?
So much on my wish list. But I did actually want to share something that has just wrapped up or even is in the process of wrapping up.
This is my next question. I was going to ask you about wins, but we can just skip straight to that.
Should I just go right?
No, yeah, this is great. Yeah. Tell us.
I will say, just to go back to, we have written all these plans. We have to do these plans. Like the Ocean Climate Action Plan is a fantastic document. So is the Ocean Justice Strategy. It's all this stuff that we can and should do. It is all not done. So if you want to see what we should do next, you can. The Ocean Justice Strategy is a little shorter than the Ocean Ocean Climate Action Plan. But if you want to read 110 riveting pages, I do recommend you to the Ocean Climate Action Plan. Wins, though, I'm so proud that as of Friday, the administration led by NOAA has finalized the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary of Central California. Yay!
It happened.
Because this is DC, I will say it is currently on public inspection and will publish in the Federal Register on Wednesday. I'm glad y'all appreciate that. But I mean, the reason I wanted to talk about that here and with Ayana and Maggie was that this sanctuary is a way that we can show that we can do conservation and clean renewable energy, and we can do it at the same time, and we can bring everyone along. And it was not easy, and
This is because there's offshore wind adjacent to it as well, right?
Yeah, there is some offshore wind leases off Morro Bay in California that have been sold, and there are developers who are going to build offshore wind there. And so the question is, how do you balance the conservation with these offshore wind needs and the need to get transmission through, so from the future turbines to the shore? And so a lot of discussion, a lot of conversations. And so eventually we have arrived at this very successful, almost 3 million acre National Marine Sanctuary, and it will be in 2 phases. So this is phase 1, this almost 3 million acres. And then phase 2 will extend further at a future time once we sort of figure out that transmission piece a little more. Mm-hmm. But I just can't say enough about, again, goes to like the power of like both working community and then working, in coalition, which is not quite the same thing, and keeping going towards this goal. And it would not have been possible without the engagement of so many across the federal government, tribes, state, community groups, the industry, and that is why we've gotten to this place of having this sanctuary come into being. So we're all very excited about that.
Awesome. I mean, a lot of work has gone into that.
It started in 2015. I mean, it was not, it was nominated by the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. I think it's 2015.
This is one of those don't give up on the big ideas things. And Maggie, I hope the example that you might give is my favorite one, that big idea that you've carried through a whole bunch of different political leaders. So can you tell us about the American Climate Corps?
Happily. I'd love to.
Champion
we almost got
of the American Climate Corps, Maggie Thomas. How many of you have heard of it before? Oh my God.
Oh,
Maggie Thomas, you're probably famous in this room. I mean, I just have to say, Maggie is the behind the scenes person who's been championing this since day one of the Biden-Harris administration, and like against all odds, pulled together the people to make it happen and the resources, even when Congress decided to appropriate $0 to the program. So yeah, tell us why the applause are justified, because it really is that exciting.
Yeah, this is a great example of not giving up on big ideas, but also the power of coalitions and the inside-outside game, frankly, that is really necessary in order to get the government to do big things. So I guess I don't need to give too much background on FDR's civilian
This is
Conservation
also
Corps.
for a podcast, so give the background.
Great.
Even though
Okay.
you guys all know all of this.
So in the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with this idea that was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the idea was to put hundreds of thousands of young men to work, giving them a job, so tackling the economic crisis, but also putting them to work on our nation's public lands. And so really tackling the environmental challenge of the problem as well. It was a wildly popular program. Young men went off. They lived in these camps. Many places that you all know are built by the original CCC. So there's a camp just south of here in Virginia that was one of the first camps that was built. If anyone has seen a concert at Red Rocks, outside Boulder, Colorado. That was built by the original CCC. So lots of these big sort of landmark places around the country, the young men of the CCC have their literal handprints on. Over time, the program faded, administrations changed. But when it came to 2019, fast forward from like 1930 to 2019, very quickly, this became one of the sort of main asks from the youth climate movement. To have the federal government stand up what then was called the Civilian Climate Corps. And the idea was the exact same. Give young people jobs in the clean energy economy, train them to do the work that we know we need to have done to tackle the climate crisis in communities across the country, and pay them to do it, and make sure that that work actually is having a clear climate impact in communities across the country as well. And so much like the Blue New Deal, the story of the American Climate Corps takes many twists and turns. It has faults and starts. It has lots of good days, and it also has lots of bad days, like the day that it didn't end up in the Inflation Reduction Act. But at the end of the day, President Biden really felt like, it was a good idea then, and it's a good idea now, and so challenged the team to go back to the drawing board and figure out how, using executive action and existing authority and the new money that we had across the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, what could we do? And so last September, he announced that his intention to launch the American Climate Corps, putting 20,000 young people to work in the program's first year. We had the first class of the American Climate Corps start in June of this year, where we actually got to swear in members from all across the country from the White House, which was very cool.
And these are for jobs like installing solar panels, restoring wetlands, reducing wildfire risk, like real stuff that we need to get done in communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we were crafting the program and standing it up, we very intentionally, as a design decision on the program, took a very broad definition of what does it mean to have climate impact. So it's everything, as you mentioned, from clearing defensible space around communities who are at high risk for wildfire, to working directly in our national forests, to clear what could become fuel for a mega fire, to energy efficiency and doing work in low-income communities to make sure that, families are able to save money on their energy bills while their homes are also more energy efficient, and pretty much everything in between. So we went back to the drawing board, and we did it. And just this September, so just a few months into the program, announced that we now have 15,000 young people across the country who are all part of the American Climate Corps, which is pretty exciting. And, I think one of the really interesting parts about working on...
I'm just so impressed with you, too. I mean, how cool is it that these are my actual friends, not just colleagues? I mean, this is like what happens when you don't give up on the idea, when you do the like seemingly boring and unglamorous work of the memos and the meetings and the coalition building and the editing and the like finding of the dollars. And it's just so exciting to see. We have to start wrapping up, which is sad to me. I have one more question for them. But before we do that, inspired by these two remarkable stories, I'm hoping that you will take out the pencils that you may have been given and the little note cards that you may have hopefully received. And if you don't have those things, Janisha will help make sure that you get them. And we're just going to take 2 minutes to jot down some ideas. So here on the screen, you can see this climate action Venn diagram, something I've been talking about for years. You may have heard me say this before, but my best framework that I can offer people who aren't sure what their role is in climate solutions is to think about these 3 circles. So what are you good at? and be very generous with yourself on this. People are very mean to themselves when filling out this circle. The second is what work needs doing. Basically, we need to change so many things in every sector of the economy, in government, in corporations, in our private lives, et cetera. And then the third is what brings you joy, because if you are miserable and cranky and no one wants to collaborate with you, we won't build the biggest, strongest team, or you'll burn out. And this is the work of our lifetime, so we should be choosing things that energize us. So take a minute or two to just jot down some ideas. Maybe don't just write your way to what you're already doing. Maybe think creatively about how you could inspire more people to join you or go bigger or faster. Normally we'd play music right now, but we can't do that. So just imagine really good old school reggae vibes happening right now. And we'll be back in a minute. Do you want me to try this? Oh, the hack.
No, get your brain right on time. I know your body looking fine. Fly down the country way. News I need on the weather. I can gather all the news I need on the weather report. News I need on the weather. Hey, I've got nothing to do today but smile. We go, here I am. Here I am. You're the only little girl in my hometown. Ooh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Totally. Hey, let your honesty shine, shine, shine on me. Oh, here I am. Here I am. You're the only little girl in my hometown. Ooh, you're the only living girl in my hometown. Oh, it's that I love you, and I want you, and I need you, and I think.
So hope that was fun, inspiring something. And I hope Althea, my sister, is here. I hope our Jamaican dad is at least a tiny bit amused that we played that in a bookstore in DC. There's some stories about him in this book and how his work as an artist and architect really influenced the way I approach climate stuff. The point of all of this, of the book, of my work, is to welcome more and more people into climate solutions, to find their role, whether the Venn diagram is helpful or just a part of the book or a podcast episode or something. I just want to say hey, come on in, we need you. I have just, on this book tour, realized that my role is welcomer in some way. And so I'd just love to close out by hearing from you kind of how whether that's a role that you see for yourselves as well, how you think we can encourage more people to roll up their sleeves. I mean, the American Climate Corps is basically the best possible example of that. You're I created an entire federal program. No further questions. And then in particular, there's so many young people who are deeply concerned and maybe not sure what to do or not really fully aware of what's going on yet. And Maggie, your parents told me I should ask this question. So Maggie is going to be a mom in a few months. Miriam has 9-year-old twins. And there's obviously such an important role for parents to play in raising the next generation, not just of climate activists, but of just climate solutionists, people who are just doers, problem solvers. So I'm curious your thoughts from that perspective of that intergenerational perspective, how to welcome more people in, how to raise more people who are finding their roles in climate solutions. Miriam, or who wants to start? Okay.
I can start as my kids have arrived. I will, I think so much of the energy to do this work comes out of people's personal experiences and, what inspires them. And my kids love to walk and ride their bikes, and they do not like cars. So I am somewhat accidentally raising some tiny urbanists who feel very passionate about walkable, bikeable cities. I'm saying nothing about this location, you guys. For those of you in DC, here on Connecticut Ave, I'm not saying anything. But they have actually written the DC Council of their own volition. I remember one excerpt from my son, which started out, "Dear Mayor Bowser, do you want me to die before I have even lived?"
Oh my God.
I did not prompt this in any way. But I think the point is, they are fortunate to live here and have the option. They are now old enough, they walk themselves to school in this independence. And this is all linked with climate too, right? Like they walk themselves, they bike themselves, they're able to do that because they live in this dense walkable city. And we want that for everyone. So I think that, this next generation, part of the role can be showing them the vision that we want to go to. And I think that's something that my kids can see and want that for both in greater extent for themselves, but also for other kids. And I think that's also part of this work that we're doing here, right? We're trying to envision the world that we want to get to, and whatever way that looks to you, that is maybe where you can find your role.
This "what if we get it right" question.
What if we get it right?
Is really just an attempt to inspire us to think about our vision for climate futures, and then, oh, well, if we can imagine it, then we should just go do our part to make it real. Hopefully. Yes. Okay. Nodding. Anything you want to say, Maggie Thomas?
I guess I'd say ask me in 18 years, the next generation.
Fair enough.
But no, I think...
you don't have any specific indoctrination strategies lined up?
Not yet, but my husband is filming this answer right now as we speak, so we could ask him.
Franz, any plans? Lots of plans.
No, I think it's just really important for everybody, no matter who you are and where you are in your life, to find that role for yourself and find that thing that brings you joy and brings you purpose, and gives you conviction to wake up the next day. For me, I go into battle every day, and Miriam too, by putting on a suit. And that's the way that I, do everything that I can in my power to make this world a better place. Whether it be for this little guy or, those that are older than all of us as well. And, I think, it's just incredibly important to think about what is that role that you can play. If you are currently in school, or thinking about going back to school, I would say take a negotiations class.
Ooh, hot tip.
Another hot take.
And maybe a psychology class. I'm like, what motivates people?
Everything we do in climate work is, at the end of the day, a negotiation. Like, why do business school students get to go to school to learn how to be better negotiators than someone who's going to work in climate? That's all wrong.
Great point.
So yeah, I think it's just what moves you, what gives you purpose. And like I said at the beginning, you don't have to be a greenhouse gas accountant. You don't even have to self-identify as a climate person. You just have to find that piece of your life and that thing that moves you and figure out how to make the world a better place through your efforts.
And I would offer that if you're not quite sure what to do, we happen to be in the midst of a pretty intense election. FYI, District of Columbia. And one thing you can do for the next, how many days? 20-something, 24 days is make sure that up and down the ballot, we're electing people who get it on climate, who are going to champion these kinds of policies that Maggie and Miriam have been working on, so we can build on this incredible legacy instead of tearing it apart. So on my book tour, I've been partnering with Environmental Voter Project. We have representatives here tonight to tell you more. They were founded because environmentalists are actually really shitty at voting. In 2020, there were 8 million people who were already registered to vote and already had environment as their number one issue who did not cast their ballots. 8 million. And we all know how close these elections are, right? So they have volunteer opportunities every day from now until the election, canvassing in person in swing states, as well as phone banking. So please join me in volunteering with and supporting them to build the environmental electorate so that politicians feel like they have to run on stronger climate platforms and then keep those promises once they get into office. And also, I'm partnering with Lead Locally, which supports down ballot climate candidates because our city council members, our mayors, our public utility commissioners, port commissioners, state representatives, they're making a lot of the decisions about how quickly and how justly we implement climate policy. Our municipal composting programs, our bike lanes, our building codes, right? Our investments in public transit, that really matters, and that is local stuff. So please try to find out who's best on climate at the local level, and Lead Locally has got some great volunteer opportunities as well. I've been volunteering with and donating to these groups for as long as they've been around, basically. So I'm going to encourage you in that direction and leave you with what I think is the most important thing I want you to know about climate, and then ask you to share your answers to that. So if you remember nothing else from tonight, I want you to know that we already have the climate solutions we need. We really and truly do. We know how to move to renewable energy. We know how to be more efficient with energy. We know how to green buildings. We know how to do public transit. For the love of God, can we please get some high-speed rail in America? If anyone can make that happen, you'll be my hero forever. We actually know how to improve our food system and agriculture as well. And we know how to protect and restore ecosystems that are absorbing tons of carbon, and we can just rely on the original climate solution, which is photosynthesis. So as I've stated a bunch of times, to me, the sexiest word in the English language is implementation. So be an implementer. I know, I'm just curious, do you agree? Is this the sexiest word?
12 out of 10.
Oh!
14 out of 10.
Okay, thank you so much for validating me. What would you like people to know about climate solutions, policy, as they leave here tonight?
There's no perfect solutions, but there's a lot of good ones.
And I think I would say something that we say in our office a lot, which is that the story of climate is actually one of hope and possibilities and not one of doom and despair.
Okay. Well, that all depends on what you all go off and do, doesn't it now? But being here on a Saturday night is certainly a good indication that you're serious about figuring out some part of getting it right. So thank you so much. If you would like me to scribble some semblance of my name into your book, I will do that. I'm just so honored to be in this community with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maggie Thomas and Miriam Goldstein. Yes. Hold on, we're just going to take a photo. You're all really important to it. You're in the middle. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you keep your Venn diagrams and just, put them on the wall, inspire yourselves and each other. And there's also, if you want to hear the podcast conversation from tonight and other stops on the tour, there's my Substack newsletter. And there's a playlist QR code on the back of the bookmark, which is the most important thing to rock out. All sorts, all genres.